Okay, welcome everybody in the room and on Zoom. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Bramett. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to the fourth spring lecture of 2022. As far as I know, we host the longest running public lecture series at UVic, and over these last 3 decades, we've featured well over 500 excellent researchers. Today, we continue this tradition with a lecture by our friend and colleague, Dr. Brian Pollick. Brian is an associate fellow at the CSRS. He completed his PhD just a year ago at UVic in art history and visual studies. His work focused on late medieval art in Italy. I was actually at his dissertation defense, which I'm fairly sure, although we'd have to check the data, is probably the best attended dissertation defense in UVic history. So we have Brian Pollick having the best attendance at his dissertation defense, and we have Noam Chomsky, who gave a lecture that has now been downloaded and seen by more people, I think, than anybody has ever seen at UVic. So you're in good company. Brian's been very generous with his time, often leading richly illustrated mini seminars for CSRS fellows that take us into the complex world of Trecento or 14th century Italy and the broader world of which it is a part. That's a world that may seem far removed from ours, but which Brian brings to life in a way that demonstrates, I think, the connections between then and now, there and here. Of course, Brian also really demonstrates well the ways in which attitudes about money, selfhood, and religion in our world make it quite difficult to understand the way these things were processed in the early modern period, and therefore that makes it difficult for us to understand what these artists were often doing in their work. In addition to being generous with his time, he and his wife, Heather Lindstedt, who I think is joining us via Zoom, have been very generous with other resources. In particular, they established a graduate fellowship that funds the work of promising emerging scholars in the history of art and religion. Some of our best CSRS fellows come into our orbit thanks to the generosity of Brian and Heather. So thank you for that. We're especially glad to know that Brian has decided that the best thing to do after completing a PhD is to get a second PhD. Not a postdoc, like a whole second PhD. This is a very good news for us, since it means that Brian's going to be around the center for many years, we think, as he works on his second doctorate, this time in our history department. So before we turn our attention to Brian and his work, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Salish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Okay, Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. Is there any way to get rid of the bar across the top, because it is going to interfere?
So I don't know that you're
yeah, now you're going to have to. No. We'll just try it. Yes. Oh, no, it's back. Well, it's going to interfere either way with the slides. Sorry. Whatever we can do. Thank you, Paul. And thank you all who are here in person and on Zoom. And what I'm going to do today, my presentation is a summary of my doctoral dissertation. And I'd like to thank the Center for giving me this opportunity to share it with you. And I'd particularly like to express my deep gratitude to Paul, the staff, and the many fellows of the Center who for providing an encouraging and safe exploratory forum as I developed my research. By the start of the 14th century, what economic historians have called the commercial revolution had produced an enormous expansion of trade and commerce that in its wake profoundly affected every aspect of Western European life and thought. Issues such as monetization, urbanization, and the accumulation of great personal wealth challenged traditional modes of political and social organization and the Christian beliefs and values that underpinned them. Nowhere was this more evident than in the cities of northern and central Italy. In a Christian ethos that had long been concerned about the role and use of money because of its potential ability to corrupt individuals, it was not surprising that the initial response to these challenges was to see them as stemming from the personal moral failure of individuals, especially those involved in trade and commerce. This focus produced several centuries of invective from theologians, moralists, and pastors who denounced merchants as avaricious parasites whose behavior not only soured human relations and disrupted the natural social order, but threatened the very purpose of Christian existence, salvation. This stereotype was often expressed visually, as we can see in these two images. The first, which shows alms being presented by money lenders being rejected by the friars because their source was that they were robbed from the destitute. And here, avarice is a merchant becomes a personification for avarice. By the 14th century, however, the profession of merchant was conditionally recognized as both legitimate and useful, and that some degree of profit for labor and risk was acceptable. The specific conditions were that merchants must not be motivated by avarice, that their business practices must be honest and ethical, that they were trustworthy, and that they used some of their money for the common good, particularly in helping to look after the poor. And this too might be expressed visually, as we can see in this illumination, where you have a good money lender being blessed by angels, and this money lender is supporting these poor people over here. These attributes were what defined the moral economy and determined an individual merchant's public reputation as a worthy civic and Christian citizen. Individual merchants thus needed to publicly demonstrate that they earned and used their money within this Christian ethical framework. And one of the vehicles for doing this was through the commissioning and display of certain types of imagery. The challenge for art historians then is to understand how the plethora of merchant commissioned imagery in Trecento, Italy achieved this. And I'd add as an aside that most of the art that survives from Trecento, Italy was in fact commissioned or paid for either individually or collectively by merchants. My approach has been to develop a comprehensive textualization methodology that uses a well-defined set of analytic criteria to help reveal the motivations for and functions of these artifacts with respect to their commissioners. The model that I have constructed, as you can see in this slide, applies 8 analytic dimensions that comprehensively capture and contextualize the specific social, religious, and economic forces that shape the values, attitudes, and behaviors of merchants in Trecento, Italy. In this presentation, I will use this framework model to show how 3 particular merchants use some of the imagery they commissioned to represent themselves as honest and dutiful Christians and to promote the gratitude and prayers that they hoped would assist them in achieving salvation. However, while my focus is solely on the moral and salvific functions of this imagery, it needs to be remembered that this same imagery also served more worldly objectives, be they social, economic, or political. Let me start by briefly explaining each dimension of the model. Medieval spaces. The settings in which merchant commissioned imagery was viewed, homes, town halls, religious institutions, personal objects, were multifunctional spaces in which the entire range of human relations and transactions were enacted. Viewer responses were largely predictable based on the dynamics of ownership, social hierarchy, and prescribed conduct. And this influenced both the content and placement of imagery, especially within a merchant's home. The development of the concept of purgatory as an intermediate place between hell and heaven had profound effects on late medieval European society. By the 14th century, almost all Christians assumed that purgatory is where they would go upon their death, undergoing hellish-like punishments to cleanse them of their sins before they could be admitted into heaven. But one's time and torments in purgatory could be alleviated by the intervention of the living through what were called suffrages, masses, prayers, and memorial good deeds performed for the benefit of the deceased. I believe that merchant commissioned imagery played a strategic role in securing these suffrages, especially prayers from ordinary people. Christian symbolism. Almost all medieval imagery was suffused with moral meaning because virtually every creature, natural object, color, and material had some form of Christian symbolic meaning in context of the struggle between good and evil. Late medieval viewers were alert to such meanings through their continuous exposure to the use of this symbolism in all genres of writing and imagery, and especially in the exempla of preachers. Obligation and reciprocity. The cycle of obligation and reciprocity, that is the duty to give, receive, and return some form of recognized benefit to and from one's equals, superiors, or subordinates, was the primary dynamic governing all forms of relations in late medieval Italian society. Within this study, I focus on the ways in which imagery used these dynamics to prompt viewer responses that benefited merchants' moral reputations and generated prayers for their souls. The virtues and vices. The late medieval understanding of moral and immoral behavior was conceptualized through the 7 virtues and 7 vices. The visual representation of the virtues and vices was commonplace, and their personifications were used as personal and corporate statements of moral awareness and rectitude. Fama. Fama was one's public reputation determined by how one behaved in relation to what was expected for someone of that status and resources. Without buona fama, a good reputation, a merchant found himself distrusted and therefore isolated from the commercial, civic, and religious mainstream. Hospitality. The provision of hospitality was a core Christian value and a fundamental part of the moral economy and sacro-social relations. It was therefore of great importance in establishing a merchant's moral reputation as someone who used his resources to benefit the common good. Hospitality was also the primary context in which visitors saw the imagery displayed within a merchant's home. And finally, coats of arms. The family shields that adorned the walls of Trecento merchant palazzi and objects were not just passive markers of status, wealth, and ownership, but were also images encoded with significant moral meaning based on their colors, their materials, their shapes, their designs. Merchants chose their shields in the well-established belief that the symbolism inherent in these components was understood to be representative of the owner's own character. And I'll give you an example of this at the very end. To demonstrate the utility of this model framework, I have selected as case studies 3 Italian merchants whose artistic commissions spanned the entire Trecento. These individuals and their imaged artifacts are, as we see here on the left, Enrico Scroveni of Padua and the Arena Chapel at the start of the Trecento. In the middle, Domenico Lenzi of Florence and his manuscript Lo Specchio Umano, which means the mirror of humanity, in mid-century. And on the right, Francesco Datini of Prato and the Palazzo Datini right at the end of the Trecento. These individuals constituted a cross-section of Trecento Italian merchants in terms of status, wealth, and public profile, and therefore, I believe, give us a representative sample. I will now discuss some of the key findings based on using this framework. The Arena Chapel in Padua, shown as it is here today, was built by Enrico Scroveni and decorated by Giotto between 1303 and 1305, and is one of the greatest monuments of medieval Western art. Its extensive scholarship makes it an excellent test case to see if the moral eye framework can provide additional insights. Enrico was the son of Rinaldo Scroveni, the man Dante represented as the archetype of the unrepentant usurer in his Inferno. Enrico too was involved in money lending, but he was also active in the large-scale production and selling of agricultural produce and foodstuffs. This is important because it suggests that Enrico's use of the frescoes as moral statements about money should be understood more in line with standard merchant concerns about being seen as an honest business person who earned and used his money appropriately, rather than as a specific act of atonement for his father's and his own money lending activities. It is also helpful to remember that the Arena Chapel was privately owned by Enrico and was an integral part of his residential complex, as this much later image indicates. So just a word about this. So this is, of course, this was from the 18th century, and the house had been altered during the Renaissance and Classical period by the Foscari family. What we don't know is here you can see the chapel actually adjoining the house. We don't know whether it actually adjoined the house or whether it was connected by a gallery, but that doesn't change the fact that it is part of a residential complex and was a household chapel, and that therefore affects the dynamics of everything that took place within the chapel with respect to its visitors. This means that in planning the use of the chapel and its artistic program, Enrico had a good sense of who the viewers would be and under what circumstances they would be there. This gave him the opportunity, through Giotto's artistic vision and skill, to represent himself as a morally aware Christian who earned and used his wealth appropriately. While the chapel certainly served Scroveni's temporal ambitions, at its core, it was a vehicle for Scroveni's own salvation, and therefore needs to be considered in context of the dimension of purgatory. In particular, we need to consider how the chapel would help to generate the suffrages Enrico assumed he would need to help move his soul from purgatory to paradise. This would be accomplished not only by ensuring perpetual masses for his soul, but also by using a chapel to generate prayers for his soul's well-being. And this was achieved not only through adding to his general public reputation as a pious Christian, which you can certainly see in all of these three representations of him. These two were done during his lifetime. This was his He was probably still alive, actually, when this was done in Venice, and it was later moved to the chapel. But also, he generated prayers through creating a reciprocal obligation from attendees through providing them with tangible spiritual benefits. That is, the chapel's soul-cleansing liturgical activities, the morally rewarding message of Giotto's frescoes, and the awarding of indulgences on certain occasions that would reduce the viewers, the attendees' own time in purgatory. Very, very smart. In using the moral eye framework as an analytical lens, I concluded that Enrico's strategic objectives for the chapel suggested two new important interpretations of some of the fresco's imagery. The first of these is that I believe that Giotto has actually represented purgatory in his version of the Last Judgment, something that nobody else has ever suggested. While Giotto did not have any common visual tradition to draw on for representing purgatory, he would have been well aware of the key elements that signified the purgatorial process through such popular texts as St. Patrick's Purgatory and Jacobus di Voragine's Golden Legend. In these works, souls in purgatory were tortured by demons in settings marked by fire, bridges, and mountains. These three elements, as shown here, this is fire streaming down the mountainside. Here's the mountainside here. Tormenting demons. And this is actually a bridge. So what he's done is, I think he's uniquely displayed four figures to show how the purgatorial process is working. And of course, it's located just to the left of the main cavern of hell, but adjacent to where the chapel is being presented to the Virgin. And I'll say a little bit more about that placement in a moment. If we look at the detail of this area, we can see that tormenting demons are unsuccessfully trying to drag these three souls into the main cavern of hell, in spite of their strenuous exertions. The torso of the prone upper figure, a naked woman, is being swept by flames. And I might add that in the whole of hell, these two figures and one other under the feet on this area are being touched by fire. In nowhere else in the whole of the Last Judgment does this take place. And fire is, of course, the primary means of purgation. So the figure below her, who's probably a cleric because of his dress, has the same stream of fire under his body. The figure standing on the far edge of the bridge, and you can imagine that this figure has exerted a certain amount of fun over the ages, is actively resisting the demons attempting to drag him into hell, the only person who's actually seen resisting. His resistance is in direct contrast to the juxtaposed figure of Judas, who is hanging inside hell on exactly the same plane. Judas's great sin, besides betraying Christ, and the sin that prevented him ultimately from God's mercy, was, as St. Augustine emphasized, that he gave in to despair. He hung himself, thereby rejecting the saving power of penitence. This whole purgatorial area is spatially and thematically associated with the representation of Enrico himself and the Virgin, as we can see here, and is thus both a personal message about Enrico's own worthiness and hope for salvation, as well as a didactic message of hope for the fresco's viewers. The second new interpretation arising from my research is my contention that 4 of narrative Giotto's frescoes embed the theme of Christian hospitality as part of their multi-layered meaning. The medieval period considered the provision of hospitality as a central Christian practice and was a key issue in judging both the social and moral worthiness of those who had means. One's fama as a person of note in the communes of Trecento, Italy, included the liberal provision of hospitality, not just to one's equals or superiors, but especially to the needy. However, it was also important for one's reputation that such hospitality be seen as offered in the right spirit and not merely as a form of advancing one's social or material self-interest. This Christian understanding of hospitality was well grounded in scripture and demonstrated both the heavenly rewards of providing hospitality to others, as we see in the image of St. Louis on the right, as well as the eternal punishment that awaited those who failed to do so, as we see here with, this is the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, sometimes called Dives. And of course, the rich man ends up roasting for eternity in hell. But a good Christian host catered not only to his guests' physical needs, that is food, drink, and shelter, but also to their spiritual needs in the form of opportunities for attendance at Mass, confession, and spiritual comfort and guidance. In this sense, the Scrovegni residence and chapel were ideal vehicles for such hospitality. Enrico, through his familial business and civic relationships, would have hosted a steady stream of guests, and these persons would have participated in activities in both the house and the chapel, receiving earthly nourishment in the house and spiritual nourishment in the chapel. 3 of the fresco panels, the wedding at Cana, the Last Supper, and Pentecost, juxtapose the provision of hospitality and the act of hosting in the spiritual setting of the chapel with that provided by Enrico in his adjacent house or arena area. In the case of the Last Supper, there is both the anticipation and experience of receiving a holy meal at the Mass and the anticipation of an earthly meal in the house. For the wedding of Cana, the setting for Christ's first public miracle, in which he turned water into wine, we are presented with a celebratory feast that every viewer had experienced and could reasonably expect to experience again, perhaps immediately in the house after being in the chapel. Pentecost also reflects the anticipation of a group of connected men gathered around a table, in this case to be fed by the Holy Spirit. But this sense of being nourished not only by physical food, but by emotional connection as they dine together is something that viewers could also anticipate. The raising of Lazarus is, I suggest, especially related to the theme of hospitality because of Giotto's unusual iconography. This panel tells the story of Christ restoring his friend Lazarus to life 4 days after he died, after being summoned by his sister, Martha of Bethany, who had been Christ's hostess at their home. In similar period renditions, including another one by Giotto or his school, Mary of Bethany, who is also thought to be Mary Magdalene, is always cloaked in red and is given visual precedence over her sister. Oh, sorry. There, and there. And this is Martha. Here. However, in the Arena Chapel version, their positions are reversed, with Martha being given visual precedence over Mary. I'm suggesting this was done deliberately to emphasize the importance of hospitality and hosting as a Christian virtue. Martha's role as the holy hostess was well publicized through scriptural exegesis and popular legend in text and sermons. Jacobus de Voragine, whose Golden Legend was a source book for much of Giotto's narrative scenes, wrote passionately about Martha as Christ's hostess. He reported that at the time of her death, she had a vision in which Christ appeared to her saying, quote, "You welcomed me into your house. I shall welcome you into my heaven. And for love of you, I shall listen favorably to those who invoke you." Voragine thus captured the popular essence of Martha as the patroness of all hospitality providers in the late Middle Ages. And this role would have been well understood by viewers who would have recognized the virtue and eternal rewards of being hospitable. And in this, they would also have been prompted to be thankful to the one who was their host, Enrico Scroveni. Now let's turn to Domenico Lenzi. Around 1340, a small-time Florentine grain merchant, Domenico Lenzi, dates probably 1305 to probably 1348, composed a book which he had copied by a professional scribe and then illuminated with 9 high-quality miniatures according to his specific instructions. The result was a unique manuscript the author titled Lo Specchio Umano, the Mirror of Humanity. The codex consists mainly of lists of grain prices between 1320 and 1335, interspersed with observations about the grain trade in Florence and detailed descriptions of events relating to the social impacts of grain shortages. Lenzi also included moralizing aphorisms, religious invocations, and his own verses. Lenzi saw these shortages as God's retribution for Florentines' lack of gratitude and compassionate sharing with the poor. Therefore, or rather thereby emphasizing how such famines could be prevented in the future. There has long been scholarly interest in this manuscript, primarily for its description of the grain trade and associated events. However, the issue of why Lenzi wrote it and how he used it to achieve his goal has been largely ignored. I've used the Morali model to provide the contextualization necessary to address both these issues by situating Lenzi within his various social, business, and religious networks and within Florentine book culture. What emerges is a man who is sincere about prompting his fellow citizens' moral renewal, but who also takes pains to represent himself as someone whose own awareness and behavior gives him the moral authority to counsel them, and thus is also one worthy of their respect and prayers for his own soul. Lenzi achieves this by presenting himself in both text and image in 3 distinct ways. Let's take the first of these, as an honest and ethical and knowledgeable merchant. Lenzi demonstrates his expert knowledge of the grain trade throughout his book, but he specifically tells us that he is honest and reliable, as shown in this quote. "I will tell the truth without lying to anyone who wants to know about the prices of wheat and other grains, both the cheap and the expensive." He also dissociated himself from the actions of some grain merchants who were hoarding grain to raise prices, referring to his colleagues' torture and subsequent punishment as a, quote, perfectly good thing. These textual references are reinforced by the two-panel self-representation of him at the very start of the book, as we can see here. In the upper registry, Lenzi is confidently purchasing grain, accompanied by a young man who's probably his son. In the lower register, he's in his small shop at the market, selling grain and keeping a careful record of the exchange in his account books in accordance with civic and guild regulations. Therefore, through doing this, he establishes his identity as an honest merchant and righteous Christian who believes in the fair distribution of grain. The other two forms of Lenzi's self-presentation, that of stern moralist and compassionate Christian, are similarly supported in the interweaving of the text and images. Lenzi, as a stern Christian moralist, constantly reminds his audience of the consequences of ingratitude to God and failing to live righteously. In this folio, for example, which shows an abundant harvest, God is expressly declaring that such plenty is dependent on his remaining satisfied with people's behavior. For he's sounding the warning here. This is actually, you can't see it very well, but this is actually God. And he's saying, I can take it all away, so be thankful to me. And as you can see in this quote, he's also quite capable of being particularly harsh with his fellow Florentines. It is not from you, O vicious and proud man, that comes abundance or any other earthly or heavenly good. So, and in the end, he says, are you so besotted with the current abundance that you have forgotten the past famine? And similarly, we can see Lenzi's voice as a compassionate Christian when he comments on the here, the poor are being expelled from Siena, and these same poor are being received in Florence by private citizens who are feeding them, giving them money in one case, looking after them. And here is a figure dressed very much as Lenzi was dressed. And so there's some suggestion, or I'm making a suggestion, this may well be Lenzi himself. So what we end up with here is seeing acts that are personal acts of kindness and mercy that function as visual models for viewers and reaffirm Lenzi's own compassionate values. Let's go to our last one. Francesco Datini and the Palazzo Datini. Datini was a self-made entrepreneur who became one of the wealthiest men of Italy. And he built and decorated a large palazzo in Prato, which is about 10 miles from Florence in the late 14th century. And we have an enormous amount of documentation because we have 150,000 of his letters and account books. So because of time, I'm going to move a little quickly here. So here this just gives you a sense of it, the present state. And one of the largest image is a rendition of St. Christopher, who visually dominates one's exit from the palazzo. So that's the main door right there, out into the street. So this is certainly conventional in terms of St. Christopher's well understood protective role for those who are traveling, but this image and its placement also has a more complex meaning because St. Christopher exemplified not just someone who protected people, but he was also a role model for somebody who gave up seeking earthly power. And this part of his character was also well understood and well represented at this time period. And so Datini, in providing these images, thus provides a gift to the viewers, both in protecting their bodies and souls from harm through St. Christopher's agency. And here we talked about Christian symbolism. All of these elements actually have meaning. They're not just decorative. Most art historians have referred to them as simply fashionable and secular. But in fact, every one of these has some kind of meaning, such as the silver fleur-de-lis, which indicates the Virgin, the wolf attacking the stag. Over here, you have the red rose bushes, which represent the Virgin. You have a stork and a heron here. And here, you actually have a cat, which also has the meaning of laziness and lust. Interestingly enough, it has both meanings, as it also represents the Madonna. The courtyard also contained, the decorative function of the didactic function of the decorative program was especially evident in the loggia, which featured cycles of the virtues and vices and of illustrious persons. So these were all designed to show Datini's own kind of moral awareness, as well as remind others. So it both provides a didactic function in reminding others, as well as pointing to Datini's own. And these are an example of some of the illustrious figures, all of which had well understood meaning. And finally, I just want to say a word about this is a shield. This shield, the silver was indicated as purity or innocence. The red is status as a person of worthiness and note. And also the slants, these are called bends. They indicate someone who's faithful. And you remember earlier I said that that shield, what was on a shield, could be indicated to the actual character of the person. And so when Louis of Anjou, he awarded Datini the right just before his death to put his own emblem, the gold fleur-de-lis on the blue background, on his own shield. And the charter specifically says that the color gold spoke to Datini's probitas and the blue to his purity of soul. So I believe that my study has broadened our understanding about how merchants through the Cinquecento used imagery to represent their Christian moral identity and how they expected this would assist them in their quest for salvation. In presenting their moral eye through imagery, these merchants demonstrated how art was a practical and functional tool for a class of persons who, however imperfect they were in practice, never doubted that their commercial activities were encased within the moral economy. Indeed, such visual representations actively reinforced the belief that economic activity was inseparable from notions of individual moral behavior and the collective common good. These are not, I maintain, archaic concepts, but carry deep resonance for us today as we navigate the complexities of global economics in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brian. That was wonderful, as usual. So we have about 15 minutes for questions from Zoom and or questions from the room. Rachel, so you can ask your questions and you can actually audibly ask your questions or ask them via the chat to Rachel and she'll flag me and we will have her represent your questions.
And Paul may have to act as my interpreter. My hearing is not what it used to be.
Yeah, Peter.
I'll just ask one to start the conversation. Brian, you and I talked about this on email. Where did all this money come from? Even the money lending, what were the people doing when they were borrowing that money? Was it just to keep the local economy going, or was it to support a larger effort?
If we look at the Scroveni family, for example, they would lend money two ways. They would lend to municipalities. This is a time when you get urbanization started, and urbanization requires the expenditure of monies to create the public types of infrastructure, the governmental administration. And one of the main methods for doing this was to borrow the money and then pay back at rates of interest that could vary. In the case of Scroveni, they were only charging about 15% per annum. But the legal statute for Vicenza, for example, said you could charge 40%. So they were borrowing this money, and so were individuals, usually to purchase and develop land. So they were what we would think of as mortgages. They were not usually personal consumption loans.
Rachel.
Thanks, Brian. Zabine on Zoom has a great question. So Zabine asks, this is a lot of effort for virtue signaling, something we see today in a different way with the visual cultural productions available in the digital marketplace via social media like Instagram. So Zabine wants to know, is there a difference between the aesthetics that represent the moral identity of the Christian merchants in the commissioned art and their moral practices in day-to-day life? Or were they trying to manufacture this narrative to compensate for a lack of that? Is identity and practice the same in the moral economy?
So she begins by talking about virtue signaling, the idea of articulating one's virtue almost excessively in these kinds of public expressions of virtue. And she's curious about if I am rendering her correctly, she's curious about the distinction between public virtue and private virtue. Yeah,
they're really one and the same, because one is trying to demonstrate within both publicly and within one's intimate circle that one is a kind of morally aware, honest person. All of this imagery is essentially semi-public, because whether it's, of course, it's absolutely public if it's in a town hall, such as in Siena, the Palazzo Pubblico, which has those wonderful frescoes of good and bad government. But even within a home like Datini, Datini probably had thousands of visitors. So in this sense, these images are very, very much personalized, but made public. And they're also made public even in public spaces, such as in Siena, where there's also a virtues and vices cycle. So you can't really separate them, is really what I'm saying there.
I think part of it is, do we know anything about these people beyond their own self-presentation? So does it line up, or are they trying to pretend there's something they're not through the images?
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Amongst contemporaries, Enrico, well, let me put it that. Some of the surviving records are, of course, from people who either like them or dislike them. We have both. So we have a contemporary of Enrico's who basically says he's a liar, hypocrite, who manipulated the Pope. His father was also denounced most famously by Dante as an archetypal user. But we have other documentation. So for example, we have somebody else who says, Rinaldo Scroveni was this great man. He was well known for his hospitality, and his name was respected throughout Italy. So the point is that this is also a time period where business practices were not what we would necessarily think of as our definition of honesty might be different. So in this sense, of course, that all people want to represent themselves as somehow being better than they are.
Except people here, other people.
Of course. Justine has a question, or two questions. First, did you notice any interest in particular religious orders among the merchants? And second, within your series of case studies, did you notice change over time?
Let me answer the first one. The merchants, if there was an order they were particularly close to, it was usually the Franciscans. And the reason was that the Franciscans were the great economic theorists during the 14th century in Italy. They were the ones that essentially started to define the trade and commerce and wealth as theologically acceptable. So in the case of Datini, he was a great patron of the local San Francesco, the local Franciscan church, as well as many other Franciscan orders, and his personal confessor was also a Franciscan. So the answer would be that you often found these relationships particularly close between merchants and the friars, and the three big friar communities were the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinians. And there were lots of minor ones as well. And the second question?
Did you notice change over time?
In general, no, not throughout the whole. One of the things that I have argued is that the reason we can use this approach, this particular model, is that it remains, the issues, the concerns remain remarkably intact over the whole course of the Trecento. So right at the end of the, right around 1400, you have a friend of Datini's writing saying, "You're opening a bank. Are you nuts? You're going to destroy your reputation as a merchant because they're going to think you're a usurer." So the answer is, in general, that the kind of large-scale issues were largely the same. You certainly don't see any changes in the imagery and in what the imagery addresses.
Thank you very much. My name is Amy. I was wondering, as I'm not very familiar in this field, are your insights different from what we normally think about? So is this interpretation drawing a new insight, or is there conflicting evidence, or are people looking at this differently than you do? And how can other people maybe take your analysis and work with it to inform their own views on this? So just out of interest, because I'm not an art historian. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Well, like every other scholar, I am building on the work of others. What I've done is, so some of these issues have long been recognized. What I think I've done is given them greater depth and specifically looked at this issue of why did they commission this imagery? And how did they use it? And what were the actual workings of that? So for example, people have been writing for centuries saying, well, this imagery, kind of was to show them as pious people and play a salvific role. But not many people have addressed, say, well, how exactly does it do that? And also in at least two areas, as far as I know, nobody has ever found purgatory, actually spotted purgatory in Giotto's Last Judgment, and the same with hospitality, and also with respect to Lenzi. Well, in respect with Lenzi, why did he do it? Nobody has really addressed that issue. And of course, in part, it's conjectural. But in the end, my work, like all scholars' work, builds on the work of many, many other people. And what I've provided is the latest word, not the last word.
Thanks. Back, go ahead.
During the last part of your presentation, you mentioned the connection between present time and the time period that you're talking about there. Can you draw any further connection between maybe the merchants or the current economics, and if there is a stride towards the morality that they had during that period, or do you think that people are less inclined to do fair trade as they did?
You know, one of the reasons why I really became interested in this topic, as you know, I'm a fairly new scholar. I didn't come to this until I was well into my 60s. And I was a business person. And one of the issues for me as a business person was, you know, what is it that drove me and others in terms of being satisfied that what we're doing was ethical and honest. And on one level, of course, we don't do it because we're worried if we don't do it, we're going to go to hell. But this sense that of public reputation, of having a sense of being an honorable person, of having a reputation as someone who whose word is trustworthy, I would argue that those are really, really important concepts. And in particular, we've kind of moved from depending on God to punish them to the law to punish. But I would argue that we've got a lesson to learn about being really clear about the morality of business practice and business ethics. So
That was a very good question. Thank you for that. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit more about, you know, there's been lots of talk about people who put their names on museums or whatever, and then we discovered that they were heavily involved in pharmaceutical misdeeds or whatever. And then people begin to have mixed feelings about going to such and such a museum or, receiving such and such an award because it actually comes from money that we now know is actually tainted. This notion that somehow there's good money and bad money is, I think, in some sense, animating some of the questions you're posing, which I think were really insightful.
And that's very much a medieval concept, the idea of tainted money. So, for example, one of the reasons why in my dissertation I talked about it, it wasn't time to do it here, but Dante, interestingly enough, when he represents the usurers in hell, he doesn't name them. He gives us their family coats of arms. It's the only place he does that. Why does he do it? Because the coats of arms denote the family, and the nature of usury is the family is tainted because they've inherited dirty money. So this idea, a sense that that how money is earned matters not just today, but throughout the future is very, very much a medieval concept. And I would say that that overrides the sense that, oh, well, they had different values back then, so we can forgive them. I would say, no, in terms of their own time, those kinds of things would have been considered.
One of the things I liked about your dissertation so much is somewhat different from what you just said, which is that you took people, modern readers, into the world of Trecento, Italy, and helped them understand that purgatory was real in the same way that Detroit is real or Winnipeg is real. I mean, that these were kind of places that were just, as you put it in your lecture, part of the assumed mental architecture of the way people went about their worlds, right? And I wonder if you could speak to that, because that is a way in which that world is very different than our world, right?
If you want to look at the concept, of course, it's about you're either saved or you're not saved. Mm-hmm. Think of it as the internet. The internet is like eternity. It's forever. So in that sense, I would argue that you've got some ways in which your reputation and your legacy forever may really depend on how you behave and how you're perceived by others as behaving. I didn't address that in my issue, but as you were talking, and suddenly, because the sense of salvation is it's eternal, it's forever.
Yeah.
Well, so is the internet. However you get represented on the internet is never going to change.
Thanks. Scott?
No, just.
Oh, sorry. Scott is drawing my attention to the time. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Brian Pollick. It's wonderful. As I noted, whoops, Brian. For a long time. So you'll have a chance to hear more of his thoughts on his second PhD. And next week, same time, same place. Actually, 102. Are we in 102 right now? Thanks, 102. We have a visitor from England coming to hang out with us for about a week. And his sort of key academic presentation is happening next Thursday at 12 o'clock. So look forward to seeing you there. Take care, everybody. Have a good week.